I'll tell you that I'm really truly delighted to be able to welcome you to our webinar, which, as you know, at least some of you may know, is the latest installment in a series of interesting webinars that were organized and facilitated by Tel Aviv University and its friends around the world since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. I'll just begin on a personal note and say that I'm so happy to take part in this webinar series because for me, it really is an example of what may be one optimistic facet of this crisis. And that is the way that it has, despite forcing us into social isolation, despite forcing us to take refuge behind the four walls of our home, it has at the same time challenged us to find creative ways to make connections, to reassert the value of friendship and of community and of conversation. And these webinars that we're holding at Tel Aviv University, I think, are one good example of how in times of trouble, we can still come together as a large global family of Tel Aviv University. So I'm truly happy that you're all here with us. Today's webinar, I think, is a little different from some of the previous ones, and it's different maybe in two ways. The first is that in previous meetings, we addressed mostly topics that are global and universal in scope. We talked about COVID-19 in relation to medicine, to mental health, to technology, to privacy, even to music. Issues that affect human beings regardless of where they're located in the world. But today we will be zooming in on a specific national and geographical context. We will be discussing Israel and the Middle East in relation to the COVID-19 crisis. Now, of course, as you know, COVID-19 entered the Middle East at a turbulent time. You could say, when is it not a turbulent time in the Middle East? But think of where we were here in the Middle East just a few short months ago. Civil war in Syria, large-scale social unrest in Lebanon, a refugee crisis in Jordan, escalating tensions with Iran, dropping oil prices in the Gulf, leading to all kinds of instabilities, Israel in the midst of a political crisis, and the list could go on and on. Today, we will try to figure out what happens when a deadly epidemic enters into this already boiling cauldron of Middle East tensions. The second reason why this webinar is a little different from the previous ones is because I will be inviting our two speakers not to limit themselves to describing what happened since February or what is happening at the moment, but to be bold and speculate also on how the crisis may shape the future in the Middle East in the coming months and maybe even years. And as usual, of course, we invite all of you to chime in with your own questions through the Q&A option on your screen below. So we're lucky to have with us today two leading experts on Israel and the Middle East. We're very much up to the challenge of the questions that we will pose. So let me introduce them. We have with us Professor Yossi Shain, who is the head of the School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs here at Tel Aviv University, in addition to being a Professor Emeritus of Government and Diaspora Politics at Georgetown. Professor Shain's list of books and articles is really much too long for me to recount here, but I will mention his most recent book, which was a bestseller, I think still is here in Israel. And it has the provocative title of The Israeli Century and the Israelization of Judaism. And I believe it will soon also be coming out in English. Professor Shain is also a regular participant in makes frequent media appearances, both here in Israel and abroad. Our second distinguished speaker is Professor Sesor, who has taught Middle Eastern history here at Tel Aviv University for over 35 years and was the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Professor Sesor was a visiting professor at several universities, including Cornell, Chicago, and Brandeis. And he was also the Stein Family Professor of Modern Israel Studies at the University of Arizona. Once again, I don't have time to list all his books, but I will mention just one, and that is a book titled The Emergence of the Modern Middle East, which came out in 2017. I particularly want to mention that because an online course with the same title is also offered by Professor Sesor online, and it has been attended so far, but I think over 100,000 students from at least 160 different countries. So if you are so inclined, do look that course up and hear more from Professor Sesor. Yossi, let me begin with you. Let's delve straight into the heart of Israeli politics. On March 2nd, 2020, as everybody knows, right as the coronavirus was beginning to make its presence felt in Israel, Israelis went to the ballot box for the third time within 1 year. An election that resulted, again, for the third time in a stalemate. At the background, of course, are Netanyahu's indictments in November, and it seemed like Israel was headed for a prolonged political paralysis at best, if not a devastating constitutional crisis at worst. 3 months and one virus later, Netanyahu is prime minister, and we have a government. What happened there? How did the coronavirus reshape Israeli politics in the last 2 months?
First of all, thank you so much, Milette and Asher, very good friends. Good to see you. When you asked the question, Milette, I suddenly thought that maybe coronavirus is not a disease, but maybe it's a panacea for Israeli politics, helping to reshape it. But certainly, your question is a good one, because coronavirus came to Israel at the height of a constitutional and a political crisis, a severe one. And the fact of the matter is that people were speaking in terms of a civil war. These are the things that were articulated by the leaders of the opposition to Netanyahu. And the situation has been quite acute in the minds and hearts of many because of the rivalry and the inability to release us from this kind of like deadlock in the two, I wouldn't say ideological camps, but certainly camps that emerged in Israel. One was the right-wing camp, which is also a very interesting term, because Netanyahu has a camp with two ultra-Orthodox parties, which in recent years become suddenly right-wing, notwithstanding their very questioning of Israel's sovereignty as a modern state. And the other, which was labeled a left camp, notwithstanding the fact it was really right-wing in its message. So it was, in fact, an election sequence, many elections regarding the legacy or the future of Netanyahu. And this has been, I would say, really a difficult time for many Israelis, because they couldn't see how to get out of this trap that they have been experiencing. The coronavirus came and also added another dimension. Israel entered a period of emergency. So there were many worries about the fact that an interim government, not yet being elected for quite a long durée, from November of 2018, one has to remember, it's not 2019, to 2020, where the government without legitimacy, without being elected by the public, and Netanyahu, of course, could distribute any power he wanted to any minister, and holding to power, and in fact embellishing their power, because the Knesset could not undermine the government. When a government is an interim government, between the collapse of the old regime and the election of a new government, what you have is that the government is free of the monitoring of the Knesset. So we entered a period which was quite dangerous to democracy, In this period, of course, we also had to deal with Netanyahu's own future because of indictments which were brought by the Attorney General. And there was a sense, especially among many in the, let's put this way, the intellectual side of Israel, or the more liberal side of Israel, that the government, the interim government, is basically eroding Israel's democratic character, because there was all kind of an assault on the legal system, which was indicting Netanyahu. This was one issue. The coronavirus, therefore, when it came as a possibility for healing the wounds. Not, people didn't see it in the beginning like that, but immediately when the coronavirus started to hit its various centers in Israel, the coronavirus became a possibility for healing the wounds, even though we went into another round of election at early March 2nd, as you said, March 2nd, as you described it. So we went into the elections, and very quickly we went into a closure and curfews. This was kind of like almost synonymous with Jewish holidays, with the Israel's Independence Day, with the Holocaust Memorial Day, all of the above coming, and Netanyahu is at the helm, with evening broadcast to the nation, which many people thought was kind of like hijacking the issue into a political issue. And that became really heightened moments about what can happen. And since the third election, which was again held in March, was not coming with a decisive victory to any side, it became another gridlock in the Israeli system. So we went into an emergency period. This emergency period, of course, put at the top of the agenda the healthcare of Israel. And during this period, some very interesting thing happened. To begin with, the recruitment of the entire Israel. You had two things that happened, I think, and I don't want to take too much time here, but I want to say two things for the first question. The first was the very incredible mobilization of the Israeli society, this time not against an external enemy. And this was really interesting because it mobilized the entire population, including Arab Israelis. Arab Israelis became important players in this emergency situation, not as part of the enemy, but rather as part of the medical system. More than 20% of Israel's medical systems were Arabs. And for the first time, Israel was protecting its citizens, including the Arabs. Second, there was something which happened in Israel during the emergency period. It became clear that Israel had a problem with the ultra-Orthodox. Very early on, the ultra-Orthodox and their authorities were not heeding to the government's requests for segregation, for 2 meters sort of separation, for all kind of like requests that came with the emergency of the corona, above and beyond, because the orders of the rabbi that the Torah study is much more important right now than the disease or the threat of the disease. This led to involvement of the Israeli army, including in ultra-Orthodox cities, which in turn created kind of a proximity between the Orthodox and the state. So I want to begin by commenting that regardless of what I described as a premise for my beginning of the talk about the two sides, the two poles of Israeli society in political terms were really clashing, and people were articulating the danger of civil war, the coronavirus created kind of like a sense of commonality, even though some people said it was used and abused by the emergency power of Netanyahu and his government. But at the same time, it forced people to somewhat close the ranks because they didn't have any other choice, whether it was manipulated or whether it was forced on them, or whether it was a desire that came with the people who are locked at homes. That was the sense of wanting to create a greater commonality and greater kind of like a familiar kind of like Israeli sense, rather than the bickering that informed the Israeli society before and during all these elections. So these were the two trends, which eventually led to the creation of what people call a unity government, albeit it's not a real unity government, but it's still a government that comprises the large segment of the Israeli populace within the government, and that we can talk about it later. What does it mean?
So let me push you a little bit further on this line of thought. So you're presenting a picture where, you know, for the first time, maybe in many, many years, Israel is revealing its strength as a society, right? Coming together around a common crisis, expressing solidarity, putting aside private interests for common good. And these are strengths that some people believed Israel no longer had, and here they emerged in this crisis, a kind of a closing of ranks. On the other hand, there is a limit to how much this solidarity could carry minorities, and especially the Arab minority, politically, because at the same time as this was happening, we also witnessed a political situation where the Arabs, who are, as we know now, very prominent in the health system. There are doctors, there are healthcare workers. They're very much seen as part of the solution to the crisis. At the same time, they're held back from political participation. So I guess my question to you in relation to the Arab minority, as well as the ultra-Orthodox minority, how far will this sense of solidarity in crisis carry over, do you think, into the future of Israeli society, and to what degree will it make any changes in the way in which minorities are represented and are viewed as part of the people?
There are two processes which are happening simultaneously in Israel, or I don't know, side by side, I don't know simultaneously, but side by side. One is the growing involvement of Arab Israelis in Israeli society. We see it in our university. The number of Arabs in universities have tripled since 2006. And they have become incredibly visible in every aspect of Israeli society. Second, we see time and again in every survey that we are studying, including the surveys which are done by the Democracy Institute in Jerusalem, they are doing regular surveys, that Arab Israelis say that they are proud to be Israelis. Not just that, they're proud to be. Proud is kind of like a word, and that's quite remarkable. 54% to 45%, depends how, this is a large numbers. And yet, the Arab Israeli political echelon, or the 15 seats that Arab Israelis have in the parliament, which is huge, it's a huge chunk of Israeli political out of 120, are perceived by the Israeli main parties, including Likud, of course, and so was also the Kahol Lavan, the blue and white, as not partners for coalition building, because in the minds and hearts of these politicians, or by the articulation of some of their politicians of the Arab parties, they're somewhat still remain kind of like a fifth column. Those who are supporting the radical Palestinian enemies of Israel or whatever. So we see these two phenomena: the Israelization of Arabs, who speak more and more Hebrew, as we know, who are engaged in Israeli society, who see themselves also trying to reap the benefits of the Israeli technological achievements, who saw what happened, and Asher probably will elaborate on that, in the Middle East during the mayhem of the so-called Arab Spring, which turned into a chaotic situation. And they see themselves and say, we want to be part of this, we want to have a chunk in it. And they got and engaged in politics, in voting. Their vote in the 3 rounds of voting was not against Israel in that sense, but rather to become part of Israel. They call it the home. Israelis, as you know, very much constantly fight about the home. Everybody has a claim on Israel as their home. Right, left, whatever it is, they have a claim, including the Haredim. The Haredim who constantly were looking at Israel sort of like as sojourners. They are not part of it like they are in the diaspora. In recent decades, become incredibly patriotic. They are part of the right wing, notwithstanding the lack of desire to join the army. But there's still, if you look at all the surveys, they are against returning territories. They even have respect for the military's victory and adopt some kind of like a Zionist lingua, a different lingua than the founding fathers' Zionist lingua, but still a lingua. The Arabs, in that respect, have not been Zionized, but certainly Israelized, with a deeper claim or larger claim for belonging. This is what we have seen also now. What we saw during the corona was quite amazing. Not only that the Arabs were part of the medical system, but the military comes to Arab neighborhood in Arab cities, and they collaborate with the military because they understand the difference between an army fighting against Arab neighbor or Palestinians, and an army that come to bring food and medicine and care to protect them against the corona explosion, with tremendous compliance among the Arabs. So these are kind of like conflicting developments that we are watching in the Israeli society. They don't always sit well with a kind of a grand design of the breaking of the Israeli society, because this also exists, but there's also kind of like a desire to be part of this large society which is emerging here of Arabs, Jews, and within the Jews, what President Rivlin calls another various tribes that are existing in this country. They see themselves as part and parcel. They see themselves as people who want to shape it and even want to participate in the government. Last point I want to make. During the coalition negotiations, and this was people didn't pay attention, those who considered the Arab parties as nemesis, like Avigdor Lieberman in the past, were those who were calling to have an alternative coalition to Netanyahu with the Arabs. They were working very hard to build it, not a coalition government, but with the support of the Arabs. Netanyahu and the right wing were trying to delegitimize this move as an anti-patriotic and something which is unacceptable. But I can tell you, because I was also involved in some of the discussion, that the people that you could not imagine were discussing the possibilities of Arabs supporting from the outside the coalition, because they were distinguishing between the Arab politicians who are hostile to the Zionist cause and the Arab Israelis who are eager to be part of the state of Israel and benefit from the economy, benefit from the security, and benefit from the life and future they can have in academia and other places in Israel.
Thank you, Yossi. Yeah, I'm sure Asher will be able to add some insights about that as well in a second, but I do want to ask you, Yossi, one last question before we turn to Asher. And again, I'm pushing you to make some predictions here. This weekend, you published in Ynet, Israel's leading internet news source, an article about Trump's deal of the century and where you think it is headed. So let's talk for a moment about that, about the deal of the century. And specifically, I want to ask you, can Netanyahu's explicit goal to annex parts of the West Bank by July be met, given the opposition of the Democrats in the United States, the warnings that we've been hearing from Europe, the Palestinian authorities' threat to back down from bilateral agreements, and the lukewarm attitude of half of Netanyahu's own government towards annexation? How do you see this scenario unfolding in the next few weeks?
I'm sure Asher has much to say about it too, but what I will say, what I wrote is the what we call the plan of the century, so to speak, become the sort of the trap of the century. What is happening here? The Trump plan, which is quite an interesting plan, and was crafted with lots of wisdom, I would say, regardless of people's objections, was accepted by Netanyahu and Gantz before the elections, as they both were summoned to the White House. In the plan, and I just want to give too broad, there was this discussion about a Palestinian state, which Netanyahu always wanted to deny, but was talking about a certain degree of Israeli legitimacy to Israeli annexation, or let's say taking over territory in the West Bank as part of a permanent solution. For the Palestinians, of course, any territorial concession is unacceptable. For Netanyahu, any idea of Palestinian state in the West Bank is unacceptable. So what Netanyahu did, he just adopted the notion that we will annex because the Palestinian will never accept, in any case, that it's not 100% of the West Bank. So we don't have to address them about the state because they will reject it. They always reject. So we will just move for the annexation. But this is a trap in some respect. Now, the Democrats, of course, are completely against it. The articulation of last week of Joe Biden and others told Israelis, don't do it. The Americans are quite leery about the fact that what happened in the Middle East in recent years, the rapprochement with the Saudis, with the states in the Gulf, with Jordan and so on, may be somewhat would disentangle because of Israel's unilateral move of annexation without accepting Palestinian statehood. And the Trump administration is uncertain what it wants to do with Netanyahu. On the one hand, they are incredibly intimate friendship, intimate friends for throughout the Trump administration, with Trump recognition of the Golan Heights and Jerusalem and the embassy moving to Jerusalem, but yet they don't want to spoil the whole thing after they work so hard on it. What I wrote about is we're in kind of a trap that we don't know yet what will happen. Netanyahu needs this because it was his promise. It's a political move. No one knows what it will give. But the idea for Netanyahu to say to the right wing, who is not right now in this coalition, I am going to annex. I will make a historic change. And with Trump, it's a unique opportunity. And also it's something that will be kind of like against the vulnerabilities of Netanyahu in the legal system, as he already entered the court. Netanyahu trial just began. It was postponed because of the corona, but it just began in May. So what we have is a kind of, I don't think that Netanyahu will withdraw from his request. The question is whether the Middle East will suddenly explode in one way or another. Or the Palestinians, of course, are threatening. The Jordanians are threatening. Other Arab states are not so keen about this move. And we will have to wait and see. But certainly it's a move that Netanyahu wants also politically, as much as he's not certain what the benefit will be, or whether there will be the kind of like a disaster looming, which of course he's not is leery about that. But the question is how far he's ready to move. We will have to wait and see. I don't want to predict because it's very much tied to its own political future because of his trial.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe then this is a good time to turn to Asher and turn this question over to you, so that you could add the perspective of the Palestinians, the Jordanian perspective. How do you analyze this crisscrossing of these two events, the corona crisis on the one hand and Trump's peace initiative on the other?
Well, first I'll take a look at the broader Arab picture and the corona crisis. We've been talking for 20 years and more now about the crisis of the Arabs. And this links very much onto what Yossi was saying about the growing integration of the Arabs of Israel into Israeli society. The Arab world around us is a picture of pessimism and hopelessness that can only encourage the Arabs to look more towards Israel as their genuine home of which they are proud to belong, as Yossi was saying. There are three major deficits that the Arab countries suffer from, and that have brought them to this situation of catastrophic socioeconomic crisis. The three deficits are these: the deficit in political freedom, the deficit in first world education systems, and the deficit in gender equality. For reasons that I won't go into in much detail, but all these three combine to create economies that are very weak, that are characterized by massive populations with a very weak resource basis. As a result, the Arab countries are in very profound crisis. This lack of gender equality, for example, leads to a very low participation of women in the economy. You cannot have a first world globalized economy without high performance and high participation of women in the economy. If half the population don't work, you have poorly performing economies. This is the foundation of the Arab crisis. The so-called Arab Spring was this massive expression of hopelessness by an entire generation of young people between the ages of 18 to 30 who have absolutely nothing ahead of them. Into this situation of profound crisis, which the Arabs were having great difficulty getting out of, comes the corona crisis to make things infinitely worse. Low oil prices, the fact that millions of workers from poor countries like Egypt and Jordan who work in the Gulf were sent home and therefore don't bring home their salaries, the remittances as they are called. International transit traffic doesn't go through the Middle East anymore because of the economic crisis. There's no tourism to the Middle East. One can only ask now, if the Arabs were in such profound crisis, before the corona, what is going to allow them to extricate themselves from the crisis now? It looks even more hopeless than it did 6 months ago or 9 months ago. These countries, the poorer countries of the region, are going to need massive international economic support. Where is that going to come from? In the post-corona international economy, which is in great crisis. So we're looking to a future which is, I would say, very pessimistic if we look at the socio-political realities of the Arab world. Then there is another point, and that is the Arab Spring seemed to be eroding authoritarian regimes. Presidents who we thought were presidents for life were overthrown in a number of countries. Corona has reinforced authoritarianism. The populations are deeply dependent on what the central government has to offer in the situation of crisis. They feel that they are deeply dependent on the central government for their very existence. And therefore, these authoritarian regimes are only reinforcing their power all over again as a result of the corona crisis. And this is true in Egypt, it's true in Jordan, Turkey, Iran, you name it. It's all over the region. Oppositions are far less willing or capable to confront the government in these circumstances. The Arabs are therefore in a situation of great weakness. And here I come to the question of the Trump initiative, the deal of the century, as it is called, the idea of Israeli annexation. As weak as the Arabs are, it is highly unlikely that we will find either the Palestinians or neighboring Arab states who will cooperate with the idea of Israeli annexation. As weak as they are, it looks as if the Palestinians are going to resist to the extent that could cause Israel a great deal of difficulty. If they do dismantle the Palestinian Authority, Yossi was speaking of a trap, Israel could be dragged into a situation where it may have to annex much more of the West Bank than it really intends to annex because of the demographic population issues. The issue of Jordan and the deal, the deal of the century and annexation. There is a very common, I would say, error made by analysts in Israel. And the argument is, well, the Jordanians are going to have to resist this because there's a very large Palestinian population in Jordan, and they are anti-Israeli, and the king and the elite have to play to the audience and therefore resist these kinds of Israeli actions. I think that is a very wrong analysis of what really drives the Jordanians. Annexation by Israel of territories in the West Bank that will create a situation that will make the creation of a Palestinian state virtually impossible for the Jordanians is a threat to their national security. This is not an issue of playing to the Palestinian audience. From the king down, they see this as a threat to the country's very existence. And their analysis is clear. If there is no Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation, and there is annexation, and perhaps a growing Israeli-Palestinian confrontation, the end result will be some catastrophic confrontation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which will end with hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in Jordan, adding to Jordan's already intolerable refugee situation. And that Jordan as a country will not be able to face this kind of demographic aggression, as they call it. The consequence, therefore, for the Jordanians of no resolution towards a Palestinian state is a threat to the country's being. And therefore, Jordan will oppose what Israel is doing. This will erode the Israeli-Jordanian treaty To what extent is difficult to say. The Jordanians are not going to rush to cancel the treaty. They need it too. They also need the relations with the United States. So the Jordanians have to play this very carefully. But it will be very difficult for this Arab world, as deep as the crisis may be in the Arab countries, to acquiesce passively to the Israeli act of annexation. And I will say one other thing, last comment from me in this round. The rise of Iran. The rise of Iran is not so much because of Iranian strength. Iran is suffering terribly from the corona crisis. But Iranian regional reach, Iranian regional influence is not so much a function of Iranian inherent power and strength, but a function of this Arab weakness that we're talking about. Iran has regional reach because the Arabs are so weak. And because the Arabs are so weak, they have tended in recent years to look for connections with Israel. That is the basis for the kind of alliance under the table that Israel has with countries like Saudi Arabia and countries in the Gulf. It will be very difficult to turn this alliance between Israel and these Arab states into something more solid if we progress with the idea of annexation that they will find very difficult to go along with. So I think we have to think very cautiously about how to proceed with this idea, which may fulfill a variety of different kinds of national aspirations. Israel has to ask itself very seriously, in real terms, what does this give Israel on the ground?
Thank you, Asher. I want to add another actor into the story that you told us now, and that is Egypt. Everything that you've described in terms of this endemic weakness or series of deficits in the Arab world, of course, apply greatly to Egypt
Yes.
as well. And just from, looking from afar at how the coronavirus impacted Egypt so far, we see some interesting things, right? On the one hand, this kind of authoritative or authoritarian response that you've described earlier. For example, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but that Egypt every evening is under complete lockdown. Nobody leaves the house after sunset. On the other hand, the economic fragility of Egypt forces it to do things like, for example, open hotels in Alexandria or along the North Shore, because Egypt is so reliant on its on tourism that it can't afford to really protect itself from incoming coronavirus. So maybe as our other partner in the region alongside Jordan, maybe you could share with us a little bit what you think about the situation there.
Well, I think the situation in Egypt, needless to say, is very difficult. The Egyptians may be desperately trying to keep the tourist industry alive, but they haven't succeeded. Egypt has millions of workers who bring back remittances to the Egyptian economy, which have all disappeared. These are huge percentages of the Egyptian GDP. The question of the actual impact of the corona crisis. Egypt has a very understaffed, undermanaged, badly run medical system. The numbers coming out of Egypt are not very bad. The question is, can one really take these numbers seriously? According to the official statistics, there are less than 1,000 deaths from corona in Egypt. I find that hard to believe in a country which has more than 100 million people with a medical system which is in tatters. There is very little transit going through the Suez Canal, which just a few years ago, the Egyptians doubled the size of the Suez Canal in order to increase international transit trade. So those major components of income to the Egyptian economy, oil and gas, remittances, transit trade, tourism, are all down dramatically. And Egypt, even in the best of times, with its population growing by another 1 million people every 6 months, is in an impossible situation. And it was very difficult before the corona crisis. The big question I would ask myself, and I have no answer to that, who in the international community can help to bail Egypt out when this is all over? Very difficult to identify. Saudi Arabia used to help the Egyptians quite a lot. But Saudi Arabia these days is having a difficult time helping itself. Oil prices are very low. The Saudis have had to suddenly charge their own people taxes, which the Saudis in the good old days didn't have to do. So there is very little outside sources of possible recovery for Egypt in this very difficult situation. We do have a very important relationship with Egypt, which is not only about the peace between Israel and Egypt, it's also about managing Gaza. Again, I come back to this, the deal of the century and annexation. We rely heavily on Egypt and the good relations with Egypt to manage Gaza. If Egypt steps away from that because of the discomfort that will follow an act of annexation, that will be another difficulty for Israel to meet with. So if we have both Jordan and Egypt in a situation of crisis and mounting difficulty and criticism and tension with Israel, problems potentially with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. What will Hamas do in Gaza? Will they keep the peace or will they let the rockets fly again? And if they do, what do the Iranians do? What does Hezbollah do? These are all questions that are hovering out there, where an Arab world in a situation of such profound crisis and hopelessness may resort out of this hopelessness to rash measures that no one would like to see.
We do have some questions on the Q&A panel to ask you, Asher, in regards to what you've just spoken about. One person would like to know, in what way exactly do you mean that refugees into Jordan will threaten its regime? If most of the citizens of Jordan now, the majority are of Palestinian origins, why would more Palestinian comers present a threat to the king?
Well, precisely because the Palestinians are a large component of the population. Jordan already has somewhere around 50+ % of its population of Palestinians. There are about 1.5 million Syrian and Iraqi refugees in Jordan from the civil wars in the neighborhood. The fear in Jordan is that a major clash between Israel and the Palestinians will lead to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians leaving the West Bank or being forced out of the West Bank in order for Israel to straighten out its own demography, and that these hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will not only be an added economic burden on the state, that it will further increase the Palestinian population in Jordan to the detriment of the Jordanian political elite, who don't want to see this happen. They see this as a threat to their political patrimony. Just a few months ago, about 6 months ago, the Jordanian army carried out a major training maneuver which practiced a clash with Israel. And the maneuver was designed for the Jordanian army to practice and to train for an event in which Jordan would be attacked from the west, which means only Israel. So this is indicative of the kind of tensions that are mounting in the relationship between Israel and Jordan. And this is the analysis that Jordanians make. If we want to understand how they see the deal of the century, the Jordanians, as I'm sure you all remember, just a while ago, discontinued the arrangement whereby Israel was allowed to use plots of land that actually belonged to Jordan as part of the peace treaty with Israel. And there were two areas that Israel could use for agricultural purposes, even though they actually belonged to Jordan. And these arrangements were made for 25 years and could be renewed for another 25 years. Well, after the 25 years, the Jordanians discontinued the arrangement. Not because they needed these plots of land, which are not particularly impressive, but because they wanted to demonstrate to Israel how dissatisfied they were with the lack of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian domain. The Jordanians need peace between Israel and the Palestinians. They see that as securing their own longevity. They see insecurity between Israel and the Palestinians as insecurity on their border with the potential threat to Jordanian domestic stability. So the Jordanians have an interest in the creation of a Palestinian state. When Israel gets up and says that it will not allow the creation of a Palestinian state, the Jordanians see that as undermining the fundamental logic of the peace treaty.
Thank you, Asher. Let me turn back to Yossi, because there's a question here for you about Israeli politics. The question is from Stephen Adler, who asks, do you believe that Netanyahu will give over the leadership to Gantz in 18 months? And if so, do you think that he has plans to become president?
I think if I say I believe that Netanyahu will turn the prime minister to Gantz, I'll be one of the few in Israel who believe that Netanyahu will do so. I don't think that Gantz himself believes so. When he was asked directly, do you think you're going to be a prime minister? He said, I don't know. Netanyahu said he will. Look, we live in the era of Netanyahu in Israel. We have been with Netanyahu now straight for 11 years. And prior to that, of course, Netanyahu was the prime minister between 1996 to 1999. And Netanyahu was trying to shape his positions of power as if he is identical with the state. That's how he sees it. Every time he is articulating a security issue, he says, it's me or nowhere, or no one. I am the only one who can really do it. Vis-a-vis the Iranians, vis-a-vis the United States in the international arena, and of course, vis-a-vis the Arabs themselves. Netanyahu is also kind of like trying to make, I would say, a direct link, and you see in his articulation, between Ben-Gurion as the founding father of Israel to him. There are only two relevant leaders almost to Israel, Netanyahu and Ben-Gurion. And Netanyahu, of course, had what one can argue, quite a lucky moment when Trump came to power. With Obama, he had a total clash. And his legitimacy in the eyes of his own people was kind of like eroded because he had to accept the Obama plan of a two-state solution and articulating it in what was known as the Bar-Ilan speech. Later on, he could renege on his own promise, and now he doesn't speak about it anymore, even though he accepts in principle the deal of the century, which, as I stated, has in the deal a Palestinian state, albeit a smaller one of 70%, and not in the 98% of Olmert or the 92% that we had before. So Netanyahu went into this coalition reluctantly. He couldn't find any other coalition. They were trying to find what they call deserters from the other camp, which was basically disintegrated. But Netanyahu also understands, and he knows, that many in Israel, and this is a huge understatement, don't like him. As much as he has tremendous followers, and his camp are really, there's almost, I would say, an admiration for Netanyahu of a unique manner. Netanyahu uses all the media and all the social media to generate this kind of like enmity toward the state system. He is what people call in the international media and in scholarship a populist. He's going above the system to the people. He is the incarnation of the people. That's how he presents himself. At the same time, he's incredibly vulnerable because of his trial, and also because there is tremendous dissatisfaction among the people. So he needed added legitimacy. The fact that he could bring his own opposition to accept him while he is a sitting prime minister who has to go to court and to face charges of corruption, this is for him quite a great achievement, because this kind of like will allow him to be more respectable in the minds and hearts of other Israelis. Keep in mind that during this last election, Netanyahu was called by the opposition Erdogan. He was called as a dictator. They were using the words dictatorship. They were using the words, tougher words even against him, as a man who basically took over Israel without legitimacy. Now he has this legitimacy. Now, to what extent he will try to find an honorable exit? He may have to find an honorable exit because it's in the hands of the judges. If indeed the judges find him guilty, and he, we had a prime minister already was sent to jail, don't forget. The former prime minister of Israel he was sentenced to 2 years in jail because of other allegations. Similar, but not even as harsh as Netanyahu right now. We don't know what will be the results. So Netanyahu has to navigate the ship. On the one hand, he presents himself as a man who really could see what Usher discussing, this kind of like the mayhem in the Middle East, and he was navigating the ship. He tried to describe himself as a man who is advancing Israel into this kind of like cyber technology. We are number 5 or 6, whatever he likes, kind of like we are champions. He's like trying to navigate the ship by kind of like holding a very strong coalition with the ultra-Orthodox. He's trying to keep like the periphery by saying, we are protecting Israel, is Mr. Security. And yet, Usher says, and I think he's right, and what I said before, there are vulnerabilities here. We don't know what will happen with the annexation. Will it explode in his face? And above and beyond, the corona crisis has exposed Netanyahu for the first time in his run in power to the vulnerabilities of the economy. We are in an economy that closed the country with over 1 million people unemployed, with kind of like an underneath tensions that is building because of, we spend money, not like the United States $3 trillion, but we had to spend over 120 billion, or at least the pledges, or 140. And right now we spend money. And how are we going to put it together? To what extent is coronavirus sort of stopped the incoming tourism to Israel? To what extent sort of the industries of Israel will be shut down for foreseeable kind of like future, right? We don't know what will happen. These are challenges that Netanyahu haven't faced before. He had quite a smooth ride, especially after Obama left office. And also because initially he had a smoother ride because of what happened in the Arab, in the Middle East, and the Middle East coming, collapsing almost. And he also had a very interesting ride, successful ride vis-a-vis the Iranians. He's the one who positioned himself vis-a-vis the Iranians. And here it is that the American adopted this position. So he could position himself in world affairs as an international leader. He likes to position himself as an international leader, someone who really understands international affairs. We don't know what will happen. And as a result of that, of course, as your question is, it will be very much related to the internal affairs, to the development in the region. And if he could see that he has somewhat to extricate from his position, maybe a deal with the Attorney General, and some even people say maybe he'll run for the presidency. It's not running, so elected for the presidency. So maybe Gantz is the man who will inherit his position. Gantz, in the meantime, is kind of very low key, is not attacking Netanyahu, even though Netanyahu speak very harshly against the legal system, the police, kind of like debunking the system that indicted him and now judging him. And what Gantz is doing is basically saying, I'm here to prevent chaotic situation and civil strife. That's why I'm here. I kind of gave up on something in order to maintain the brotherhood of Israel, regardless of my criticism of Netanyahu. Too early to tell. So many things will happen. We'll see if Trump will remain in office or not. We'll see what will happen in the Middle East. We'll see how the economy will grow or not. But the idea of believing Netanyahu, I don't know. I don't think that anyone in his own party or anyone in the system has a statement that he believes Netanyahu, because they call him the magician, and the magician is a word saying he will navigate and don't believe in any word, and including his own allies. So notwithstanding the fact they don't believe him, they have to live with what they have, hoping against perhaps all hopes that he will abide by his own promise, that he will allow the Gantz to take over. In the meantime, what they did, which is quite remarkable in Israel, they almost changed the constitution, even though we don't have a constitution, by having this dual heads, Netanyahu and the replacement head of the government. They even talked in Israel about two homes for the head and the replacement head. This is quite remarkable. People maybe don't know, but it was brought to the Supreme Court. Israel say, look, they're changing the constitution. They are legalizing things that we don't have here. It's a kind of a different system. It's almost like cohabitation in France. I don't know what it is. It's different. Of course, there they have a president, a prime minister of a different nature. But they were trying to concoct this government of endless ministers and the vice ministers that basically hijack the entire political system. We don't have a Knesset today. We don't have a checks and balances as we used to have. So Netanyahu, on the one hand, he's the only show in town, but yet vulnerability is there. And I will say one more word. He broke his own coalition for the sake of building this one, especially with what they call Yemina. This is kind of like the right, the religious right wing. They will not forget this time. They have been, this time, the sting was too difficult. So I don't make predictions because Netanyahu, of course, survived, managed to manipulate his way. If you will ask many experts a few months ago, after the indictment came down, they said he has to go. The Supreme Court, he has to go. The fact of the matter, Corona helped him to stay. And here he is, he's staying. And I'm sure he doesn't like to live. People say they don't know if he even have a conceptual understanding of living the house in Jerusalem, what they call Balfour, kind of like now the people saying about Balfour, because it's almost in Israel, we're talking about a kingdom. Netanyahu, his wife, his son, it's kind of like the Holy Trinity. So we have a completely different story regarding Netanyahu.
Thank you, Yossi. Unfortunately, we're really running out of time. We have about a minute left, although there are around 20 very good questions still coming that, you know, we're not going to have time to delve into. We'll be watching together in the next few months to see what happens and to what extent the coronavirus will deepen trends and processes in the region that existed here long before the crisis, as Asher seemed to have suggested to us today. And to what extent this large scale and traumatic epidemic is actually a game changer, as I think some of Yossi's comments, at least in the context of Israeli politics, seem to indicate. Only time will tell. I want to thank very much our two speakers, Professor Asher Sesor and Professor Yossi Shain. Many thanks to Ayana, who is the driving force behind these wonderful webinars. And thank you to Tel Aviv University friends around the world. Thank you all who joined us today. I hope this was interesting, as interesting to you as it was to me. Just two quick announcements before you press on your leave button on your screen. You're invited to join us again next week, next Monday, June the 8th, at 7 o'clock Israel time, so an hour later than the time in which we met today, for a webinar which title is Brave New Cyber World Under Corona. This is a topic we haven't gotten into today. Iran and the cyber wars were certainly something we could have talked about, but join us next week where this will at least part of the topic, I imagine, would also be cyber warfare. And for those of you who have not yet participated in what's called the Drop Everything COVID-19 campaign, we invite you to visit the website. The address is Tel Aviv University, one word, Tel Aviv University .crowdchange, again, one word, crowdchange.net. Tel Aviv University .crowdchange.net. So we invite you to come in and support the campaign. And on this note, be well, stay healthy, and we hope we can all meet again very soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Milette.
Thank you.